Ladies and gentlemen, there is a silent revolution taking place in the hearts of people who have long been misunderstood, underestimated, and manipulated. For years they were told they were too sensitive, too emotional, too forgiving. But something has changed. A fire has been lit. An awakening has occurred. And I have come to speak, not to the broken, but to the ones who are rising. Today I speak to the empath, not the one who cries in silence, but the one who sees in silence. The empath who sees through the narcissist is the most dangerous of all. The empath is often misunderstood. In a world that celebrates aggression, dominance, and the loudest voice in the room, the quiet strength of the empath is misread as fragility. People look at their soft heart, their emotional openness, and assume weakness. But make no mistake, the empath is not weak. The empath is powerful in ways that are not immediately visible. Their power is not in control, but in connection. Not in manipulation, but in meaning. Not in domination, but in discernment. True strength is not always loud. Sometimes it's the silent endurance, the quiet ability to feel deeply without shutting down, to carry burdens without complaint, to stand in the presence of darkness and not become it. Empaths carry a spiritual intelligence that cannot be taught in schools or measured in IQ. They possess an inner awareness, a sensitivity to emotion, energy, and intention that allows them to see what others miss. That's not weakness. That's a higher dimension of intelligence. You see, emotional intelligence is not about being overtaken by feelings. It's about knowing what feelings mean, where they come from, and what they are pointing to. Empaths are tuned into more than words. They hear the silence behind the noise. They pick up on shifts in energy that most ignore. They don't just sense when something is wrong. They know when something is off, even when it looks perfect on the outside. That's because their sensitivity is not emotional instability. It's spiritual radar. They were built to read rooms, to discern spirits, to identify hidden wounds, to feel the tremors before the earthquake. But in a narcissistic world that idolizes self over service, appearance over authenticity, and performance over presence, that gift is often mocked. Empaths are labeled as too much. They're told they're too emotional, too soft, or too intense. But what the world calls too much is actually a threat to deception. The empath's depth threatens the superficiality of the narcissist. Their sensitivity exposes the shallowness of manipulation. Their compassion reveals the cold void behind charm and ego. The empath was never created to compete in toxic games of control. That's why they often feel out of place in toxic environments. Their spirit rejects what their soul cannot tolerate. They may not be able to explain it logically, but they feel it deeply. They pick up on misalignment. They sense falsehood. And over time, they begin to notice the pattern. The charm that quickly turns into cruelty. The compliments that are laced with control. The promises that evaporate when they stop complying. It's not paranoia, it's perception. This is where their true power begins to awaken. When an empath realizes that their emotional responses are not dysfunction but divine intelligence, everything shifts. They stop doubting themselves. They stop shrinking to keep the peace. They stop internalizing blame for what they were merely discerning. That's the turning point. When the empath no longer sees their gift as a burden, but as a compass. When they realize that their tears were never weakness, but water for their inner garden. That their intuition was not anxiety, but insight. You see, narcissists manipulate through confusion, shame, and false realities. But empaths are wired to detect truth. Even if they can't immediately articulate it, they know when something is not right. And the more healed they become, the clearer their vision gets. The narcissist thrives on power imbalance, but the empath restores balance the moment they reclaim their perception. They no longer look for validation outside themselves. They don't need someone to confirm what they already know deep down. And that knowing, that spiritual knowing, is a weapon. What makes the empath dangerous is not revenge. It's clarity. What makes them powerful is not aggression. It's awareness. Because once they see the game, they stop playing it. They don't need to attack the narcissist. They simply outgrow them. And nothing terrifies a narcissist more than someone who no longer needs their approval, attention, or affirmation. The empath detaches not to punish, but to protect their peace. And that withdrawal is the collapse of the narcissist's control. So the next time someone tells you you're too sensitive, smile. You're not too sensitive. You're finely tuned. You're connected to frequencies others can't hear. And while they may mock what they don't understand, they cannot unsee the mirror you become once you embrace your gift. The world needs more empaths who have healed, who know who they are, who stop apologizing for their depth. Because in a culture that's drowning in pretense, your authenticity is radical. Your presence is disruptive. Your discernment is dangerous to lies, to manipulation, to systems that thrive on silence. You are not fragile. You are fire wrapped in empathy, power clothed in compassion. And when you finally recognize that, everything around you begins to shift. Not because you force it, but because you see it. Narcissists thrive on illusion and control, but empaths see beyond the mask. To understand the power of this statement, you must first recognize the world a narcissist creates. It's not a world of truth. It's a world of performance. A narcissist lives behind a carefully crafted image, a persona designed to seduce admiration, manipulate emotions, and shield their fragile ego from exposure. They are masters of camouflage, blending charm with control, charisma with manipulation. Everything is calculated to draw people into a narrative where the narcissist is the center, the hero, the victim, or whatever role secures power. But here's the twist. This entire ecosystem is built on the assumption that no one will look too closely. The narcissist relies on people's desire to believe in appearances. They count on the crowd being emotionally lazy, easily impressed, or too afraid to challenge what they see. They flourish in environments where truth is optional and image is everything. That's how they maintain control, by keeping people asleep, distracted by flattery, afraid of confrontation, or confused by emotional chaos. Enter the empath. An empath doesn't just hear what's being said. They feel what's not being said. They don't just observe behavior. They absorb energy, intention, and unspoken motives. That sensitivity, when not understood, often leads them to be taken advantage of. But once that same empath matures, once they wake up spiritually, emotionally, and mentally, everything changes. Because now they're not just feeling the room, they're reading the room. They're not reacting, they're discerning. That's when the dynamic shifts. The narcissist can't function in the presence of someone who sees them. Not just sees their face or hears their words, but sees through them. The empath becomes a mirror to everything the narcissist has tried to hide. The charm no longer works. The guilt trips bounce off. The gaslighting loses its effect. Why? Because the illusion is broken. And once an illusion is broken, it loses its power. Imagine a magician on stage, dazzling the audience with sleight of hand, smoke, and mirrors. As long as the audience believes in the trick, the magician holds all the power. But the moment someone in the crowd whispers, "I see the string, I know how he did that," the magic fades. Not just for the observer, but eventually for everyone. That's the empath's role. They break the spell. This is why narcissists are often drawn to empaths in the first place. On the surface, empaths are kind, supportive, deeply loving people. But on a deeper level, there's something that terrifies the narcissist even as they are drawn to it. The empath's awareness. Subconsciously, the narcissist senses the empath's depth, that they can't be fooled forever, that beneath the compassion is an inner knowing that might one day rise and confront the truth. And that truth is deadly to the narcissist's delusion. So the narcissist does everything to prevent that awakening. They use confusion as a tool. They rewrite history. They alternate between praise and punishment. They isolate. They flatter. They provoke. They do all of this to keep the empath unsure of their perception. Because if the empath ever steps fully into their clarity, the narcissist knows they're finished. Because now the empath doesn't just feel wrong. They know what's wrong. When an empath sees through the narcissist, they stop asking for validation. They stop trying to fix what they didn't break. They stop participating in the performance. And most importantly, they stop feeding the illusion. That's when the narcissist begins to unravel. You see, control is only effective when it's accepted. Manipulation only works when it's believed. Illusion only stands when no one calls it out. And silence only protects the abuser when the observer refuses to speak truth. But when the empath rises, when they speak not with vengeance but with vision, the entire structure begins to collapse. And here's the power of it. The empath doesn't need to attack. They don't need to expose publicly. Their clarity is the confrontation. Their discernment is the resistance. Their refusal to play along is what breaks the narcissist's dominance. Because the narcissist can't win a game that the empath refuses to play. It is dangerous for a narcissist to be seen. Not because someone is threatening them with force, but because someone is confronting them with truth. And truth, when it comes through the eyes of someone who genuinely cared, who loved without agenda, and who now sees clearly, that kind of truth pierces deeper than any sword. So the empath becomes dangerous, not because they fight louder, but because they see deeper. Not because they're aggressive, but because they're awake. They are no longer caught in the narcissist story. They are writing their own. They're no longer dancing to the rhythm of manipulation. They've found the sound of their own peace. And once an empath reaches this point, they become a living testimony of freedom. They represent what's possible on the other side of abuse. And that, more than anything, terrifies the narcissist. Because they no longer control the narrative. The empath does. And the moment the empath sees through the narcissist, the lie loses its power. The performance ends. And the healing begins. Discernment is the greatest weapon of an awakened empath. It is not merely the ability to detect a lie or sense discomfort. It is the supernatural capacity to see beyond what is presented. While many people are distracted by surface behaviors, the empath, once awakened, develops an inner radar that doesn't just react emotionally, it interprets spiritually. This is not about suspicion. This is about insight. It is not paranoia. It is perception. The empath who walks in discernment does not need to catch someone in the act to know the truth. They carry a knowing, a divine inner compass that alerts them not just to what someone is doing, but why they're doing it. Narcissists are masters of presentation. They craft illusions like magicians, projecting charm, playing victim, creating confusion, then offering themselves as the solution to the very chaos they initiated. But discernment cuts through the performance. The awakened empath sees the pattern before the play begins. They feel the dissonance between words and energy. They hear what is not being said. They notice the inconsistencies, the timing, the rehearsed pain, the too perfect apology, the convenient breakdown, right when accountability comes knocking. You see, discernment doesn't just look at what someone is doing. It recognizes the spirit behind what they're doing. An empath who has matured in discernment no longer gets caught up in emotional whirlwinds. They no longer internalize manipulation as their fault. They start to recognize the script, the cycle, the emotional traps. They begin to realize this isn't love, it's control. This isn't vulnerability, it's bait. This isn't repentance, it's performance. And this kind of awareness is dangerous. Not because the empath now seeks revenge, but because they can no longer be used. You cannot manipulate someone who sees your pattern. You cannot control someone who has mentally exited your game. Once the empath sees you, the power dynamic changes. The narcissist may still try the same tricks, but they lose their effectiveness. The energy shifts. The empath no longer dances to the rhythm of manipulation. They move to the rhythm of truth. This is what makes discernment so powerful. It frees the empath from the role they were unconsciously cast in. Many empaths were groomed to be caretakers, fixers, peacekeepers. The narcissist saw their compassion as a resource to exploit. Their empathy was weaponized against them. If you loved me, you'd stay. You're overreacting. You're the one causing the problem. These were the lines used to confuse the empathy's intuition. But discernment brings clarity, and clarity is power. When an empath begins to discern, they stop asking, why are they doing this to me? And start understanding this is who they are. That shift is everything. It's the moment where emotional entanglement is replaced with spiritual authority. They no longer absorb the dysfunction. They observe it. They no longer try to change the narcissist. They release them. Because discernment reveals a truth many don't want to face. Some people are committed to their deception, and your love alone cannot deliver them. This understanding does not make the empath bitter. It makes them wise. It elevates their vision. It helps them see that not every connection is covenant, that not every cry for help is genuine, that not every apology is repentance. Discernment protects the heart without hardening it. It creates distance without hostility. It allows the empath to stand in truth and still walk in love, just not the kind of love that makes them a prisoner to someone else's pathology. Discernment, when fully activated, leads to one of the most powerful revelations an empath can ever have. I don't need to stay to prove I'm good. Many empaths stay in toxic dynamics, trying to validate their own value. But discernment teaches them that walking away isn't a failure. It's faith in action. It's saying, I see what this is, and I honor myself enough to leave it. That's not cold. That's courageous. And the beauty of discernment is that it doesn't just protect the empath from others. It protects the empath from themselves, from their need to rescue, from their overfunctioning, from their impulse to prove their worth through pain. Discernment recalibrates the empath's identity. They no longer see themselves as someone who needs to earn love or fix broken people to feel purposeful. They begin to understand, I am enough. My gift is sacred, and not everyone deserves access to it. This is the turning point. When the empath no longer questions what they feel but trusts it, when they stop trying to rationalize red flags and start honoring them, when they stop tolerating cycles and start disrupting them, that is when the narcissist loses all control. Not because the empath fought back, but because the empath saw back. This sight, this divine discernment, is what transforms the empath from a target to a teacher, from a victim to a vessel, from someone who was once used to someone who now walks in purpose, clarity, and unshakable peace. And in the realm of emotional and spiritual warfare, there is nothing more dangerous than someone who can see an empowered empather, disrupts the narcissist's ecosystem in a way that is both subtle and seismic. The moment the empath wakes up to the reality of what they've been experiencing, everything begins to shift, not just within themselves, but within the entire environment that once catered to the narcissist's control. This disruption doesn't come through aggression or retaliation, it comes through awareness. And awareness is the seed of freedom. You must understand something. Narcissists construct a fragile world built on manipulation, perception, and control. They need the people around them to buy into the illusion of who they claim to be. They thrive in environments where no one asks questions, where silence protects dysfunction, and where the truth is buried under charm, fear, or guilt. Their survival depends on others not seeing clearly. But when the empath begins to see, truly see, it's like light flooding into a room that's been dark for years. The empath, by nature, is sensitive to emotional undercurrents. They pick up on what is not being said. They feel the dissonance in energy before it's ever verbalized. For a long time, that sensitivity made them susceptible to manipulation. They tried harder. They loved deeper. They forgave quicker, not because they were foolish, but because their heart was pure. They assumed the best. They extended grace even when it hurt. But when the pain becomes the teacher, when the pattern becomes undeniable, and when discernment replaces denial, the empath changes. This change is what destabilizes the narcissist's entire ecosystem. The moment the empath stops reacting and starts observing, the narcissist begins to lose power. Why? Because their manipulation requires participation. Their lies require agreement. Their control requires confusion. But a discerning empath no longer provides any of these. They don't argue. They don't explain themselves repeatedly. They don't beg to be understood. Instead, they go quiet, not in defeat, but in divine clarity. They disengage not because they're weak, but because they're strong enough to stop feeding a system that was never healthy. The narcissist feels this shift immediately. They sense the energy withdrawal before the words are even spoken, and it terrifies them because they know they are only powerful as long as the empath believes the narrative. Once the narrative is broken, the narcissist is left with their own emptiness, and nothing terrifies them more than facing themselves without an audience to control. The empath's refusal to play the game becomes the loudest resistance. It is not shouting that breaks strongholds, it's sight. And when an empath sees clearly, they become a mirror that reflects everything the narcissist tried to hide, not just from the world, but from themselves. That reflection can't be manipulated. It can't be gaslit. It can't be silenced. And that is where the true disruption lies. This is why empaths are so dangerous when they awaken. Their silence becomes surgical. Their presence becomes prophetic. They don't have to say much to change the entire atmosphere of a room. The narcissist may try to smear them, provoke them, or guilt them back into the old cycle, but nothing works anymore. The empath has seen too much, and once you've seen, you can't unsee. The disruption continues in the way the empath now sets boundaries. Where they once said yes out of fear, guilt, or obligation, they now say no with firm peace. Where they once over-explained, they now let their absence speak. Where they once tried to fix, they now release. These shifts dismantle the very mechanisms the narcissist depended on. Without the empath's compliance, the narcissist's tactics fall flat. They become visible, predictable, powerless. But the disruption goes even deeper. Because when an empath heals, they don't just walk away, they shift culture. They begin to teach others, to model freedom, to speak truth wrapped in compassion. They break generational patterns. They redefine love, not as endless sacrifice, but as healthy connection. They stop normalizing chaos. They call dysfunction by its name. And this terrifies systems that have been protected by silence for too long. The ripple effect of one awakened empath is immeasurable. Families change, friendships change, communities shift. What once felt acceptable now feels intolerable. What once passed as love is now recognized as control. The empath begins to build new environments that reflect truth, safety, and emotional integrity. And they invite others to do the same, not by force, but by example. That's the power of disruption. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to be fooled again. Sometimes it looks like a quiet departure. Sometimes it's a soft no that echoes louder than any protest. The empath doesn't destroy the narcissist. They just stop enabling them. And that single decision changes everything. The narcissist will feel the void. They will feel the silence. They will feel the weight of their own emptiness. And they will realize, perhaps for the first time, that the power they thought they had was never theirs. It was given to them by someone who loved blindly. And now that love has awakened, now that soul has risen, now the empath is no longer in their orbit. The empowered empath is not just dangerous, they are transformational. They don't just exit relationships, they exit illusions. And wherever they go next, they carry light, wisdom, and truth with them. Not to destroy, but to heal. Not to expose for attention, but to reveal for liberation. They are no longer a pawn in someone else's drama. They are the catalyst for divine order. And that's why the empath who sees through the narcissist disrupts everything. The empath's healing presence confronts the narcissist's inner wounds in a way that no confrontation, argument, or exposure ever could. This isn't about shouting, calling out, or publicly naming their dysfunction. It's about the quiet, radiant power of someone who has chosen to live in truth. The narcissist, by nature, builds their identity on a fragile construct. Layers of charm, manipulation, and projection. Because deep down, they are running from something. Beneath the grandiosity, the arrogance, the control, and the endless hunger for admiration lies a deeply wounded soul. One often fractured by rejection, shame, or abandonment early in life. But here's the thing. Narcissists don't acknowledge their wounds. In fact, they build an entire personality to escape from them. They construct a false self, a version of themselves that they present to the world, and they manipulate others to reinforce it. Anyone who threatens this illusion, anyone who holds up a mirror to their truth, is seen as an enemy. And the empath in their awakened state becomes the greatest threat to that illusion. You see, the empath doesn't just show love, they are love. They don't just speak truth, they embody it. And truth is disruptive. Healing is confrontational. Not in volume or aggression, but in what it exposes. The empath's calm, consistent energy destabilizes the narcissist's carefully curated mask. The narcissist depends on confusion, chaos, and emotional imbalance to maintain control. But when the empath stops reacting, stops over-explaining, stops defending, and simply stands in clarity, the game falls apart. The empath does not need to point fingers. Their presence alone begins to convict. The narcissist, who is used to manipulating others into submission, starts to feel something unfamiliar in the presence of a healed empath. Vulnerability. Their usual tactics don't work anymore. Gaslighting loses its grip. Silent treatment loses its power. Triangulation falls flat. Because the empath is no longer feeding the cycle, they're watching it. This is not just emotional awareness, it's spiritual confrontation. The empath carries a light that reveals what the narcissist has worked hard to keep hidden, not just from others, but from themselves. It is said that some people will hate you not because you did them wrong, but because you remind them of everything they don't want to face within. That's the empath. They carry a frequency that exposes darkness, and without ever lifting a sword, they dismantle strongholds. The narcissist might feel anger, but it's not really about the empath. It's about the parts of themselves they've avoided all their life. That's why they run. That's why they devalue and discard. That's why they rage and project. Because the empath's presence is a mirror, and a mirror, when held long enough, forces accountability. But here's the beauty. The empath isn't trying to fix or change the narcissist. That's a trap many empaths fall into before they awaken. They think their love will heal. They believe if they just give more, forgive more, bend more, the narcissist will change. But once the empath understands the nature of the narcissist's inner wound and how it functions, they stop rescuing and start releasing. Healing for the empath becomes personal. They realize that their job is not to carry another's wounds, especially someone who refuses to even admit they are wounded. The moment they reclaim their own energy, reinvest their love inward, and begin the process of self-restoration, they shine even brighter. And this brightness is what becomes intolerable to the narcissist. The narcissist often returns, not because they've changed, but because they miss the supply, the admiration, the energy, the identity they borrowed from the empath. But the empath who has healed knows this pattern. They no longer respond with hope. They respond with wisdom. That shift from emotional reactivity to spiritual discernment is the true danger to the narcissist. Because now the empath doesn't just see them, they see through them. And that clarity breaks the cycle. The empath's healing doesn't just expose the narcissist, it liberates the empath. It restores the balance. It reclaims territory that was lost in cycles of confusion and emotional labor. And that in itself is revolutionary. Because one healed empath can change the dynamic of an entire family line. One healed empath can refuse the toxic inheritance passed down through generations. One healed empath can say, no more. Not in anger, but in authority. So yes, the empath's healing presence confronts the narcissist. Not through argument, not through revenge, but through alignment. The narcissist may never admit it, but they will feel it. Because when a person who used to bleed now walks in wholeness, when the one they once broke now walks away in strength, it reminds them that truth can't be controlled. And that's the beginning of the end for the narcissist. An awakened empath becomes a mirror, not a victim. This is one of the most pivotal truths in the journey of emotional and spiritual growth. For so long, the empath has been labeled as the one who breaks under pressure, the one who carries the emotional weight of others, the one who always forgives, always absorbs, always endures. But something transformative happens when an empath wakes up to the truth of what they've been enduring. They no longer carry other people's dysfunction as their own. They begin to see clearly. They begin to detach not from love but from illusion. And in that awakening, they shift from being a sponge to being a mirror. You see, for the narcissist to function, they need someone who will play the role of the emotional buffer, someone to blame, someone to dump on, someone to gaslight, someone to control. The empath in their unawakened state becomes that person. Not because they are weak, but because they love deeply, they hope continuously, and they believe that goodness can always be drawn out of people. They try to help, to heal, to hold everything together, even at their own expense. But awakening changes everything. When the empath begins to realize that love is not sacrifice without reciprocity, that helping is not the same as enabling, and that forgiveness does not mean tolerating abuse, they begin to reclaim their power. The moment they step out of emotional enmeshment and into emotional clarity, they become something the narcissist fears, a mirror. A mirror doesn't argue. A mirror doesn't explain. A mirror doesn't try to fix or appease. It simply reflects. It reflects truth. It reflects character. It reflects motives, intentions, and spiritual reality. And that is the most dangerous position an empath can hold in the life of a narcissist, because it disrupts the entire ecosystem of control. When a narcissist stands before a mirror, they cannot hide behind their usual tactics. Their charm is no longer effective. Their gaslighting no longer confuses. Their blame shifting no longer lands, because the awakened empath is no longer absorbing. They're observing. They're no longer reacting emotionally. They're responding spiritually. They're no longer internalizing dysfunction. They're identifying it. That shift is powerful. The narcissist begins to sense something is different. Their words no longer land the same way. Their tactics no longer hold power. The empath is no longer triggered. They are centered, grounded, and unbothered. And that's when the narcissist begins to unravel. Because what they truly fear is exposure. Not exposure to others, but exposure to themselves. When someone stops reflecting back the narrative they've constructed and instead starts reflecting the truth of who they are, the narcissist experiences a type of identity crisis. They are forced to confront the hollowness of their own persona, and they do not have the tools to handle that level of truth. And here's the paradox. The empath doesn't have to say anything. They don't need to argue, accuse, or attack. Their presence, their clarity, their discernment does the speaking. That is why the empath becomes so dangerous. Not because they are violent or aggressive, but because they carry an undeniable energy of truth. And truth destabilizes deception. Truth interrupts manipulation. Truth makes control impossible. Before awakening, the empaths spent their time trying to change the narcissist, trying to appeal to their empathy, trying to explain how much they were hurting. But after awakening, they realized that trying to teach compassion to someone who feeds off of control is a futile mission. Instead of trying to change the narcissist, they change themselves. They set boundaries. They disengage. They walk away, not in silence born of fear, but in silence born of strength. That silence is louder than any confrontation. The empath becomes dangerous because they no longer serve as fuel. The narcissist begins to panic. Not because the empath is attacking them, but because the empath is no longer reacting. Reaction was the fuel. Drama was the currency. But now the empath is at peace. And peace is the one language a narcissist cannot speak. Peace renders their manipulation irrelevant. An awakened empath is not just someone who sees the game. They refuse to play it. They don't need closure from the narcissist because they already have it within. They don't wait for validation. They've validated themselves. They don't wait for the apology. They've healed beyond needing one. And when they walk away, they don't look back. This is what makes them a mirror. And not everyone can handle a mirror. Because a mirror doesn't flatter. It reflects. A mirror doesn't lie. It reveals. A mirror doesn't bend the truth. It shows it plainly. And for those who've spent their entire lives hiding behind performance, charm, and control, a mirror is the most terrifying thing in the world. So the empath who has awakened, who sees through the narcissist, becomes the most dangerous person. Not because they seek revenge, but because they walk in truth. And truth is the one thing narcissism cannot survive. Empaths carry divine justice. That may sound poetic to some, but to those who've lived it, it's a spiritual law. You see, when an empath reaches the place of awakening, when they no longer confuse compassion with compliance, when they stop enabling manipulation under the banner of love, they step into a dimension of authority that isn't loud, but it is final. Their very presence becomes a judgment to the narcissist. This isn't about revenge. It's not about retaliation. Divine justice does not always come in thunder or fire. Sometimes it comes in silence, in absence, in a door that quietly closes without explanation. And for the narcissist, that is the most terrifying sound of all. Because when an empath walks away, truly walks away, they leave behind more than just their physical presence. They leave behind accountability. They leave behind a spiritual mirror. And whether the narcissist admits it or not, that reflection stays with them. When an empath begins to see clearly, they stop arguing. They stop defending themselves. They stop proving their heart. Why? Because they recognize that the narcissist doesn't need more explanations. They need exposure. And not in a public scandal, but in a personal awakening. That awakening often starts when the empath detaches. No fight, no fury, just discernment. This is the turning point. The empath realizes they are not here to fix the narcissist. That was never their assignment. Healing was offered. Grace was extended. But grace is not permission. And mercy is not submission. The empath who sees through the narcissist understands this. And that understanding becomes the shift that unleashes consequences. Not crafted by the empath, but by divine order. See, what most don't realize is that when the empath was in that toxic relationship, they were a covering. Their presence, their prayers, their peace, it created a buffer between the narcissist and the full weight of their own dysfunction. But when the empath steps away, the covering is lifted. The consequences begin. Not because the empath seeks vengeance, but because they were the only thing holding the storm back. And when the storm comes, it's not from them. It's what was always waiting behind the scenes. Consequences delayed, not denied. People often ask, why does the narcissist spiral after the empath leaves? It's because the empath was the spiritual anchor, the one standing in the gap, the one absorbing what the narcissist should have been facing. And when that shield is removed, reality hits, accountability hits, karma, what some call reaping and sowing, hits, and no one is left to buffer the blow. That's why the empath is dangerous. Not because they harm, but because they stop protecting. Divine justice doesn't need the empath to punish. It simply needs the empath to release. And in that release, heaven moves. Cycles break. Strongholds shake. Generational patterns collapse. All because one person chose clarity over codependency. The narcissist will feel the absence more than they ever felt the presence. They'll feel the silence louder than the words. And they will begin to experience what the empath lived through quietly for years. Emptiness, rejection, isolation. Except now, there is no one to absorb it for them. No emotional sponge to soak up their chaos. No spiritual covering to deflect their consequences. They are exposed not by a scandal, but by separation. The empath does not need to announce their freedom. They are the announcement. Their peace becomes the proof. Their joy becomes the testimony. Their healing becomes the judgment. That's divine justice. It speaks without shouting. It answers without reacting. It restores without explaining. So when you see an empath rise from the ashes, stronger, wiser, and more silent than before, don't be fooled. That silence is loud in the spirit. It's declaring, I am no longer your covering. I am no longer your supply. I am no longer your host. That declaration sends a shockwave through the narcissist kingdom. The throne trembles, the illusions fall, and they are left with themselves, unmasked, unfiltered, and unprotected. The empath walks away not in bitterness, but in spiritual authority. They understand that walking away isn't weakness, it's warfare. It's the final act of love to themselves and the loudest confrontation to the narcissist. It's not about punishing the other person. It's about aligning with truth. And in that alignment, everything hidden is brought to light, not by force, but by the order of justice. When the empath finally sees, finally discerns, finally breaks free, they don't return. They don't re-engage because they know what they carry. They know who they are, and they understand that justice has already begun, not in the courtroom, but in the unseen, not by their hands, but by the Spirit. The most dangerous empath is not the one who cries, but the one who sees, not the one who begs, but the one who breaks the agreement, not the one who fights, but the one who walks away in revelation, knowing that heaven will handle what they no longer entertain. And that right there is divine justice. The most dangerous person is not the one who fights back, but the one who sees clearly and walks away with purpose. This truth cannot be overstated. In a world that often glorifies outward confrontation, dramatic exits, and verbal retaliation, there is a rare and quiet power in the one who simply understands and refuses to participate. The empath who sees through the narcissist is not interested in revenge, drama, or validation. They are after something far more profound: peace, freedom, and alignment with truth. The moment the empath sees the narcissist clearly, truly, and spiritually sees them, it initiates a shift. It is no longer a relationship, an entanglement, or an emotional tug of war. It becomes an awakening. The illusion shatters. The power the narcissist once held is no longer effective. Why? Because the fuel of a narcissist is your emotional confusion. It's the uncertainty, the doubt, the inner conflict they create in you. But when you see them, not with your eyes, but with your discernment, you take back the authority they never should have had. And what does the empath do in that moment? They don't scream. They don't need to prove anything. They don't explain their exit with 1,000 words. They walk away with purpose. That walk is powerful. It's not just a physical departure. It's a spiritual act. It's a declaration that says, I know who you are. I know who I am. And I refuse to dance in the shadows. You see, the empath has been gifted with more than emotion. They've been gifted with vision. And vision is dangerous to deception. When the empath walks away, they leave behind a silent disruption. The narcissist is left with no stage, no audience, no echo chamber. And that's where the real breakdown begins. The absence of supply reveals the emptiness of the structure. This is not just about romantic relationships. This applies to family dynamics, toxic friendships, spiritual leaders, corporate manipulation. Any place where deception has tried to dress itself as love, guidance, or authority. The empath walks in, often naive and trusting, but over time their spirit begins to notice cracks. The words don't match the energy. The apologies feel rehearsed. The charm feels too calculated. And suddenly they realize they are not dealing with brokenness that wants healing. They are dealing with ego that wants control. That's when the danger begins. Not to the empath, but to the narcissistic system. Because when one empath wakes up and walks away, they start a ripple effect. Others watch and begin to question. Others start to see what they once overlooked. Light always has a way of spreading, even in silence. The most powerful revolutions begin in the heart of the one who refuses to live under the illusion any longer. And why is this empath so dangerous? Because they don't want anything from the narcissist anymore. They've disconnected from the need to be understood, loved, or chosen by someone who is incapable of truly giving those things. They no longer engage in the performance. They no longer respond to the bait. And that non-response is the most powerful response of all. To walk away with purpose means the empath has done their inner work. They've faced their own trauma. They've taken responsibility for their healing. They've stopped asking why the narcissist did what they did and started asking, why did I stay? That kind of self-reflection builds inner strength. That kind of honesty produces spiritual maturity. And when that maturity blossoms, the empath becomes a leader, not by title, but by presence. There is also something deeply spiritual happening when an empath walks away. In many ways, it is a prophetic act. They are breaking cycles that have existed for generations. They are refusing to pass down dysfunction disguised as love. They are choosing truth over tradition. And that kind of clarity disrupts everything around them. When someone walks away from a narcissist with purpose, they are not just leaving a person, they are leaving a pattern. They are breaking agreements they didn't even know they had made. Agreements like, I must always keep the peace even when it costs me. Agreements like, their needs matter more than mine. Agreements like, if I love them enough, they will change. All those internal contracts are ripped up when the empath walks away. And in their place, new truths are written. Truths about self-worth, boundaries, and identity. This is why the empath who sees through the narcissist is the most dangerous of all. They become untouchable. Not because they are cold, but because they are no longer codependent. Not because they've shut down, but because they've awakened. They are no longer motivated by fear, guilt, or obligation. They are motivated by alignment, purpose, and freedom. And perhaps the most powerful part is this. They don't need to announce it. They don't need a spotlight or an audience. They just live. They live in truth, in peace, and in strength. And that quiet life becomes a loud statement. A life that says, you don't have to stay bound. You don't have to keep dancing with dysfunction. You can wake up, you can walk away, and you can do it with purpose. That is power. That is purpose. That is the danger of an empath who sees